It's July 1776. Philadelphia is sweltering in the summer heat. 56 men are gathered in a room, sweating through their coats, arguing, debating, second-guessing themselves, and they're about to do something that, by any reasonable measure, should have gotten them all killed. These weren't soldiers. They weren't revolutionaries in the romantic sense. Most of them were lawyers, farmers, merchants, men with families, businesses, reputations, men who had a lot to lose. And yet, one by one, they walked up to a table and signed their names to a document that declared war on the most powerful empire on the planet. Why? What made them do it? And why does that moment, that specific summer afternoon in Philadelphia, still matter so much more than 2 centuries later? That's what we're going to dig into today. Not just the event itself, but the ideas behind it, the people who lived it, and the ways it quietly reshaped the entire world, sometimes in ways you might not expect. So let's go back, all the way back to 1776. To really understand why the Declaration of Independence was such a massive deal, you first have to understand what the world looked like before it existed. And here's the thing. The world in 1776 was almost unrecognizable compared to today, not just technologically, politically. For most of human history, the idea that ordinary people had the right to govern themselves was considered absurd, dangerous even. The dominant worldview, across most of Europe and much of the world, was that kings ruled because God said so. It was called the divine right of kings, and it wasn't just a political theory. It was taken seriously. It was taught. It was enforced. Under this system, the relationship between a ruler and his subjects wasn't really a political relationship at all. It was more like ownership. The king owned the land. The king owned the resources, and in a very real sense, the king owned the people. You didn't have rights in the way we think about rights today. You had privileges, things the crown allowed you to do, which the crown could take away whenever it felt like it. Now, to be fair, this wasn't a completely clean picture. England, specifically, had been chipping away at absolute royal power for centuries. The Magna Carta in 1215 had established that even the king had to follow certain rules. The English Civil War in the 1640s had ended with a king literally losing his head, and the Glorious Revolution in 1688 had established a constitutional monarchy, with Parliament holding real power alongside the crown. So the English-speaking world already had a tradition of pushing back against unchecked authority. But, and this is important, even in England, even with all that history, the fundamental assumption was still that authority flowed downward, from God to the king, to Parliament, to the people. The people were still, ultimately, subjects. What the Declaration of Independence did was flip that entire structure upside down. It said, clearly in writing for the whole world to read, that authority flows upward, from the people, that governments exist to serve the people, not the other way around, and that when a government fails in that job, the people have the right to get rid of it. That was not a normal thing to say in 1776. That was genuinely radical. So how did we get there? The American colonies didn't wake up one morning and decide to declare independence. This had been building for years, decades, really. The British colonies in North America had been around for over 150 years by 1776, and for most of that time, they had operated with a pretty high degree of self-governance. Each colony had its own legislature. Colonists made a lot of their own decisions. Britain was far away, and for a long time, it kind of let the colonies do their thing. This arrangement had a name: salutary neglect. Britain neglected to micromanage the colonies, and everyone was more or less fine with it. But then came the French and Indian War. From 1754 to 1763, Britain fought a massive, expensive war against France, and the North American theater of that war was brutal. Britain won, but at enormous cost. The national debt nearly doubled, and Britain looked at its American colonies and thought, "You benefited from this war. You should help pay for it." What followed was a decade of increasingly aggressive taxation and control. The Stamp Act of 1765 taxed printed materials, newspapers, legal documents, even playing cards. The Townshend Acts of 1767 added taxes on imported goods like glass, paint, and tea. British officials were given expanded powers to search colonists' homes and businesses without warrants, something called writs of assistance. And through all of this, the colonists kept making the same argument. "You can't tax us without our consent. We have no representatives in Parliament. This is tyranny. No taxation without representation." You've probably heard that phrase. It wasn't just a slogan. It was a legal and philosophical argument rooted in English common law. Britain's response essentially was, "You are virtually represented. Parliament represents all British subjects, including you." The colonists were not impressed. Things escalated. In 1770, British soldiers fired into a crowd in Boston, killing 5 people. Paul Revere's engraving of the event, depicting it as a massacre, which was a bit of an exaggeration but very effective propaganda, spread through the colonies and inflamed public opinion. In 1773, colonists dumped an entire shipment of British tea into Boston Harbor rather than pay the tax on it. Britain responded with the coercive acts, which the colonists called the Intolerable Acts, closing Boston's port and revoking Massachusetts' self-governance. By 1775, it wasn't just an argument anymore. Shots had been fired at Lexington and Concord. The Revolutionary War had begun. And yet, even then, independence wasn't the automatic next step. Even after the fighting started, a significant chunk of colonists still hoped for reconciliation with Britain. They wanted their rights respected, yes, but they wanted to remain British subjects. So what finally pushed them over the edge? In January 1776, a 39-year-old English immigrant named Thomas Paine published a pamphlet called Common Sense. It was 47 pages. It cost 2 shillings, and it changed the entire conversation. Paine wasn't a lawyer or a philosopher. He was a former corset maker and tax collector who had only arrived in America 2 years earlier, but he had a gift for writing in a way that ordinary people could understand and respond to. Before Common Sense, the debate was mostly framed in terms of legal rights and parliamentary representation. Paine reframed it completely. He didn't just argue that Britain was treating the colonies unfairly. He argued that monarchy itself was a fundamentally stupid and corrupt system, that the whole idea of hereditary rule, that someone should lead a nation because of who their father was absurd on its face. He wrote directly to ordinary colonists, not to elites. He said things like, "Why should an island rule a continent?" He made the case for independence not as a political necessity, but as common sense. Obviously true, self-evident. The pamphlet sold somewhere around 500,000 copies in its first year, in a population of about 2.5 million. To put that in context, that would be like a book selling 60 to 70 million copies today in the United States alone. It was a phenomenon, and it shifted public opinion dramatically. Common Sense didn't cause the Declaration of Independence on its own, but it created the intellectual and emotional climate in which independence suddenly felt not just possible, but necessary. When John Adams later said, and this is a somewhat backhanded compliment, that without Paine's pen, the sword of Washington would have been wielded in vain, he was acknowledging just how much the public argument mattered. Ideas matter, words matter. Sometimes a 47-page pamphlet matters more than an army. So by the spring of 1776, the Continental Congress was moving toward a formal declaration of independence. On June 7th, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a resolution stating that the colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. Congress needed a committee to draft a formal declaration. 5 men were appointed: John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, and Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was 33 years old. He was quiet in debate. Adams was the talker, but everyone knew he could write. Adams later recalled asking Jefferson to draft the document, and Jefferson being somewhat reluctant. Adams supposedly told him, "You can write 10 times better than I can." Jefferson worked on it for about 2.5 weeks, mostly alone, in a rented room in Philadelphia. He later said he wasn't trying to say anything new or original. He was trying to articulate what he called the common sense of the subject, to express ideas that were already circulating, but to express them clearly and powerfully. He drew heavily on Enlightenment philosophy, particularly John Locke, the English philosopher who had argued in the late 1600s that all people had natural rights to life, liberty, and property, and that governments derived their just powers from the consent of the governed. Jefferson's version tweaked Locke's famous formulation. Instead of life, liberty, and property, he wrote life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That small change has been debated by historians and philosophers ever since. Was it intentional? Was it just more poetic? Did it open the door to a broader conception of human flourishing beyond mere property ownership? Probably all of the above. Jefferson submitted his draft to Adams and Franklin, who made some edits. Franklin famously changed sacred and undeniable truths to self-evident truths, which is a more philosophically precise phrase and also just sounds better. Then the full Congress got hold of it. Here's something the sanitized version of history tends to skip over. Congress made substantial changes to Jefferson's draft, and Jefferson hated it. He sat there, reportedly fuming, while delegates argued over his words. Franklin, sitting next to him, tried to cheer him up by telling a rambling story about a hat maker. The point being that everyone thinks they can improve on someone else's work, and usually they're wrong, but you just have to let it go. The most significant cut was an entire passage in which Jefferson condemned the slave trade. He had written a fairly scathing paragraph blaming King George for forcing slavery on the colonies, conveniently ignoring the fact that many colonial slaveholders, including Jefferson himself, were enthusiastic participants in the institution. But even that hypocritical paragraph was too much for delegates from South Carolina and Georgia, who wanted slavery left entirely off the table, and so it was removed. This is one of the great original contradictions of America. The document that declared all men are created equal was written by a man who enslaved over 600 people over his lifetime. The ideals of the Declaration and the lived reality of the country were, from the very beginning, in profound tension. We'll come back to that tension, because it's one of the most important threads in American history. But for now, after several days of debate, edits, and some fairly heated arguments, Congress voted to approve the Declaration on July 2nd, 1776. John Adams actually thought July 2nd would be the date Americans celebrated forever. He wrote to his wife Abigail that it ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shoes, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other. He was off by 2 days. The formal adoption of the edited declaration happened on July 4th, which is why we celebrate on the 4th. The actual signing by most of the delegates didn't happen until August 2nd. History gets a little blurry on the timeline, but the key point is this: the document existed. It had been approved, and now it was out in the world. Let's actually stop and read some of this document, because the language is so familiar that we sometimes stop really hearing it. The opening sentence alone is doing an enormous amount of work. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another. Notice what's happening there. It's framing independence not as rebellion, not as a desperate measure, but as a natural, reasonable step in the course of human events. It's calm, it's rational, it's almost matter-of-fact. Then comes the most famous passage. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Self-evident. Not argued for, not proven, just asserted as obviously true as things any reasonable person must acknowledge. Unalienable rights. Not rights granted by government, not privileges. Rights that exist independently of any government, that can't be taken away, that belong to you simply because you're human. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. This is the hinge. This is the sentence that flipped the entire political order. Governments exist to serve these rights. Government power comes from the people. And crucially, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government. The right to revolution. Written down, signed, published. The rest of the document is a list of grievances against King George, 27 of them, specific and detailed, building a legal case for why Britain had forfeited its right to govern the colonies. It reads a bit like a legal brief, which makes sense because it was meant to justify the break to the world. But it's those first few paragraphs that matter most. It's those sentences that echoed for centuries. When the Declaration was read publicly for the first time, July 8, 1776 in Philadelphia, the crowd apparently cheered. Church bells rang. There were celebrations. But there were also plenty of people who were terrified. Remember, this wasn't just a political document. It was a declaration of war. These men had just put their names on a document that, if Britain won the war, would serve as their death warrants. Treason was punishable by hanging, specifically and gruesomely, by being hanged, drawn, and quartered. Benjamin Franklin at the signing ceremony reportedly said something along the lines of, "We must all hang together, or most assuredly, we shall all hang separately." Whether he actually said that is debated, but the sentiment was real. These men understood the stakes. About a third of the colonial population supported independence. Another third was loyalist. They remained loyal to Britain. And the final third was somewhere in the middle, trying to figure out which way the wind was blowing. This was not a unanimous, united revolution. It was messy and contested and dangerous. Abroad, the reaction was mixed but significant. France was particularly interested. France and Britain were long-standing rivals, and France had already been watching the colonial conflict with great interest. The Declaration gave French intellectuals and politicians a framework. Here were the Americans, articulating Enlightenment principles in the most public way possible, actually putting them into practice. Benjamin Franklin was dispatched to Paris as American ambassador, and he was received almost as a celebrity. He played the role of humble American sage brilliantly, showing up in a fur hat among the powdered wigs of Versailles, representing this new idea of what a society could be. France's support, ships, soldiers, money, supplies, would ultimately prove decisive in the Revolutionary War. And the Declaration was a key part of what made that support possible. It's worth pausing here to remember that the Declaration of Independence didn't win the war. It just started something. From 1776 to 1783, the Continental Army fought one of the most powerful military forces on Earth. And for long stretches of that war, things looked very, very bad. The winter at Valley Forge, 1777 to 1778, is the most famous example. Washington's army was starving, freezing, diseased. Soldiers were dying of illness at a horrific rate. Men were deserting. There was serious doubt that the Continental Army would survive. let alone win. Washington himself wrote letters during this period that are haunting to read, describing the state of his forces, the shortages of food and clothing, the uncertainty about whether Congress could provide what was needed. And yet the army held together. The French alliance came through. The tide slowly turned. The pivotal victory at Yorktown in 1781, where a combined American and French force trapped Cornwallis's British army on a Virginia peninsula, effectively ended major combat operations, and in 1783, the Treaty of Paris formally recognized American independence. The ideals had survived. The experiment was going to continue. But now came the hard part, figuring out what those ideals actually meant in practice. Here's where it gets complicated. The Declaration was an aspirational document. It said what America should be. It didn't actually establish a government or spell out how any of this was supposed to work. That job fell to the Constitution, drafted in 1787 and ratified in 1789. And the Constitution was a political document, which means it was full of compromises, including some genuinely terrible ones. The 3/5 compromise counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for purposes of congressional representation, giving slaveholding states more political power while not treating enslaved people as citizens. The Constitution explicitly protected the slave trade until 1808. It allowed states to require the return of escaped slaves. So the document that created the American government encoded slavery into its foundations. The Declaration had said, all men are created equal. The Constitution said, well, yes. But let's not go too far with that. This contradiction sat at the heart of American life for the next 80 years. It shaped every major political debate. It eventually tore the country apart. The Civil War, which began in 1861, was in many ways the final reckoning with the Declaration's unfinished promise. Lincoln understood this explicitly. At Gettysburg in 1863, he didn't cite the Constitution. He went back to the Declaration. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He was making an argument. The Declaration's promise was the true founding ideal, and the war was a test of whether that ideal could actually be made real. That gap never fully closed. The fight continued through Reconstruction, through Jim Crow, through the civil rights movement of the 20th century. And in many ways, it continues today. Let's step back for a moment from the specific history and think about why the Declaration mattered philosophically, not just for America, but for the world. Before 1776, political philosophy had certainly grappled with questions of rights and governance, but it had mostly stayed in the realm of theory. Locke wrote about natural rights. Rousseau wrote about the social contract. Montesquieu wrote about the separation of powers. These were brilliant thinkers whose ideas circulated among educated elites in Europe. But the Declaration took those ideas and did something new. It made them the founding document of an actual country. It turned political philosophy into political reality, or at least it tried to. That's not a small thing. For the first time in the modern era, a nation was founded on explicitly stated principles about human rights and the purpose of government. Not on conquest, not on dynastic succession, not on religious mandate, but on a set of ideas about what human beings are and what governments are for. And because it was written down in clear language, available for anyone to read, it became a standard. A measuring stick. People could point to it and say, "You said this. You declared these truths. Are you living up to them?" That's exactly what abolitionists did in the antebellum period. That's what suffragists did when they wrote the Declaration of Sentiments at Seneca Falls in 1848. A document modeled directly on the Declaration of Independence, but extending its logic to women. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, That's what Frederick Douglass did in his famous 1852 speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," where he didn't reject the Declaration but held it up and said, "You have not lived up to this. The hypocrisy is the thing that makes this so shameful." The Declaration created a standard that America repeatedly failed to meet. And that failure became the engine of much of American political progress. People kept demanding that the country actually become what it said it was. Now here's something that often gets left out of the American telling of this story. The Declaration of Independence didn't just matter for America. It sent shockwaves around the world. The most immediate and dramatic example was France. The French had been watching the American Revolution with fascination. Thousands of French soldiers had fought in it, Lafayette being the most famous. French intellectuals had cheered it on, and the Declaration, with its ringing assertions about natural rights and popular sovereignty, fed directly into the ferment that was already building in French society. In 1789, just 6 years after American independence was recognized, the French Revolution began. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, adopted by the French National Assembly in 1789, is clearly influenced by the American Declaration. The same ideas, the same language, the same Enlightenment framework. Of course, the French Revolution took a very different path, far more violent, more radical, ending in the Reign of Terror and eventually Napoleon's dictatorship. The contrast between the two revolutions is itself a fascinating historical topic. But the point is, the American Declaration was part of the intellectual fuel for what happened in France, and it didn't stop there. Haiti. The Haitian Revolution, which began in 1791 and resulted in the first successful slave revolt in the Americas and the establishment of the first black republic in the world. This was happening in a world where the Declaration of Independence existed, where the language of natural rights and human equality was in the air, where the idea that people could throw off oppressive governments was no longer just theory. The irony, of course, is that the United States refused to recognize Haiti for decades. The slaveholding South was terrified of what a successful slave revolution in the Caribbean might inspire closer to home. The Declaration's ideals were fine in theory, but their application to enslaved people was another matter entirely. Latin America. Through the early 19th century, one country after another in Latin America declared independence from Spain. Simón Bolívar, the great liberator of South America, cited the American example. The Declaration of Independence was translated, distributed, discussed. These weren't copycat movements. Each had its own causes, its own dynamics, its own character. But the American Declaration had made something visible. It was possible to break from empire and claim self-governance. It had been done. The precedent existed, even in Europe. The 1848 revolutions, that wave of political upheaval that swept through France, Germany, Austria, Italy, Hungary, were animated by many of the same ideas. Liberalism, nationalism, popular sovereignty. The idea that ordinary people had a say in their own governance. The Declaration of Independence didn't cause all of this, but it was part of a broader intellectual revolution, and it gave that revolution a concrete, successful example to point to. We talk about the signers as a group, but it's worth spending a moment on who these people actually were. Because they're often either mythologized or dismissed, and neither serves us well. The 56 signers were a varied group. About half were lawyers. There were merchants, farmers, doctors, and a few clergy. Their ages ranged from 26, Edward Rutledge of South Carolina, the youngest, to 70, Benjamin Franklin, the oldest, who had to be helped to the signing table because of gout. They came from very different backgrounds. Some were wealthy plantation owners, some were self-made men. Several had emigrated from Britain or Ireland. Several were deeply religious. A few were more skeptical of organized religion. What they had in common was education, Most had read widely in history, philosophy, and law, and a deep investment in the political crisis at hand. And they did, in fact, suffer for what they signed. About a third of them served in combat during the Revolutionary War. Several were captured by the British. Others had their homes destroyed, their businesses ruined. A few lost family members. The myth that they all went on to comfortable, prosperous lives isn't entirely accurate. Richard Stockton of New Jersey was captured by the British, treated brutally, and his health was so damaged that he died in 1781. His estate was ransacked and his papers burned. Thomas Nelson, Jr. of Virginia reportedly ordered American artillery to fire on his own home in Yorktown when he discovered British officers had taken it over. Whether that's entirely accurate is debated, but it captures the kind of sacrifice the war demanded. John Hart of New Jersey, a farmer in his 60s, was forced to flee his home when British forces advanced. His wife died while he was in hiding. He returned to find his farm destroyed. He never fully recovered. These weren't just men who signed a piece of paper. They were men who put their lives and livelihoods on the line for an idea. That doesn't make them perfect. Some were slaveholders. Some had other significant flaws, but it does mean they deserve to be taken seriously as real human beings making real, high-stakes choices, not just icons on a pedestal. Among all the founders, the relationship between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson is one of the most fascinating, and in many ways it mirrors the complexities of the Declaration itself. Adams and Jefferson were collaborators in 1776, co-architects of American independence, close allies in the early years of the Republic. Then politics pulled them apart. They ended up as leaders of opposing political factions. The Federalists, Adams, and the Democratic Republicans, Jefferson. In the 1800 election, they ran against each other, and it got ugly. Campaigns were vicious. Accusations flew, their friendship collapsed. For years, they didn't speak, but in their old age, they reconciled. A mutual friend, Benjamin Rush, encouraged them to resume correspondence, and they did, exchanging hundreds of letters over more than a decade, reflecting on the Revolution, on their lives, on what America had become and what it still needed to be. The correspondence is remarkable. They're two old men, former rivals, thinking back on the most consequential period of their lives. Sometimes they agree, sometimes they still argue, sometimes they're clearly talking past each other, but it's honest and human and deeply interesting. And then, in one of those moments that history seems to arrange for dramatic effect, both men died on July 4th, 1826. The 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Adams' last words were reportedly, "Thomas Jefferson survives." He didn't know that Jefferson had died a few hours earlier. Two of the three primary authors of the Declaration of Independence dying on the same day, 50 years to the date after its adoption. You can't write history this compelling. It just happens. History tends to focus on the famous, the Jeffersons and Adamses and Franklins. But the Declaration mattered to ordinary people too, and in ways that are worth thinking about. For white male colonists, independence meant something immediate and concrete. They would govern themselves through their own elected representatives, rather than being subject to a parliament in which they had no voice. Property rights would be protected by their own laws. They could build a life without the arbitrary interference of a distant government. These were real gains, meaningful gains. The degree of political participation available to ordinary white men in early America was genuinely remarkable by the standards of 1776. But the Declaration's language pointed further than its immediate application. The idea that all men are created equal, that all people have unalienable rights. This language had a logic to it that went beyond its author's intentions or their willingness to act on it. Enslaved people heard it. There are accounts of enslaved people gathering to hear the Declaration read aloud and responding to its promises. Some use the language of natural rights in petitions to courts and legislatures. A few won their freedom through legal arguments rooted in Revolutionary-era principles. Women heard it too. Abigail Adams, writing to her husband John as he was helping draft the laws of the new republic, famously told him to remember the ladies. She didn't get what she wanted. The founding generation had no interest in extending political rights to women. But the logic of the Declaration made that exclusion increasingly hard to justify over time. Immigrants heard it, the Declaration's universal language. It doesn't say all American-born men or all Englishmen. It says all men. That universalism was part of what made America an attractive destination for people fleeing oppression elsewhere. The ideals pulled people toward the country even when the reality fell short. Every oppressed group in American history has had to grapple with the Declaration, either using its language to demand inclusion or confronting the hypocrisy of a nation that claimed these ideals but didn't live them. That dynamic has defined American politics for 250 years. One of the most important things about the Declaration of Independence is that it has never stopped being relevant. It keeps getting picked up and used by different people in different times for different purposes. Lincoln used it to reframe the Civil War as a fight over the founding ideal of equality. Susan B. Anthony used the Declaration's logic to argue for women's suffrage. She was arrested in 1872 for illegally voting, and at her trial she argued that the Constitution, rightly understood in light of the Declaration, guaranteed her the right to vote. The Civil Rights Movement used it constantly. Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech is built around the Declaration. He called it a promissory note to which all Americans were entitled, a note that America had defaulted on for Black Americans. He wasn't rejecting the Declaration. He was demanding that it be honored. International movements for self-determination have used its language. Ho Chi Minh, in declaring Vietnamese independence from France in 1945, opened his declaration by quoting the American Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's an extraordinary thing. The language of a document written by Virginia slaveholders in 1776 was being used by a Vietnamese communist revolutionary in 1945. Whatever Jefferson and his colleagues intended, the words they wrote took on a life of their own. That's the nature of genuinely great political writing. It escapes its authors. It becomes a common resource, something anyone can pick up and use to make their case, to hold power accountable, to demand something better. So what does any of this mean for us today, more than 240 years later? A few things worth sitting with. First, the idea that government power comes from the people, that governments are created by citizens to serve citizens, and that citizens have the right to change governments that fail them. This is now considered basic common sense in most democratic societies. But it wasn't always. The Declaration helped make it so. When we vote, when we criticize our governments, when we protest, when we expect our leaders to be accountable, we are operating in a world partly shaped by what those 56 men signed in Philadelphia in 1776. Second, the universalism in the Declaration's language has been a constant force pulling societies toward greater inclusion. The logic of all men are created equal has been hard to permanently contain. Once that idea is out in the world, once it's the stated foundation of your society, every exclusion has to be justified, and that justification gets harder and harder to maintain over time. That's slow. It's painful. It involves struggle and setback and enormous human cost. But the trajectory is real. Third, the Declaration reminds us that ideas have power. Paine's pamphlet, Jefferson's words, the Enlightenment philosophy that fed into both. These weren't just abstract thoughts. They moved people. They changed what seemed possible. They created a world in which independence from empire was something you could declare and fight for and actually achieve. We sometimes get cynical about the power of ideas. We focus on money, on power, on military force, and yes, those things matter enormously. But ideas shape what people believe is legitimate, what they're willing to fight for, what they consider worth dying to resist. The Declaration was a declaration of what ideas the new nation stood for, and it committed the nation to those ideas in a way that couldn't be entirely undone, even when the nation fell terribly short of them. And fourth, the Declaration is honest about something that's easy to forget. It acknowledges that change is necessary, that when a government fails its fundamental obligations, people have not just the right, but arguably the responsibility to do something about it. It doesn't say governments are inherently good or that authority should never be questioned. It says authority has to earn its legitimacy. That's a demanding standard. It requires citizens who are engaged, informed, willing to hold power accountable. It requires the kind of civic culture that Jefferson and his contemporaries hoped, not always successfully, to cultivate. We've talked about the contradictions, but let's sit with them a bit more directly, because they're important. Thomas Jefferson wrote, "All men are created equal," and enslaved over 600 people. He knew the contradiction. He wrote about it, agonized over it in private, and did very little about it in public. He freed only a handful of enslaved people, and most of those only after his death. He died deeply in debt, having mortgaged his enslaved workforce to cover his extravagant lifestyle. George Washington enslaved over 300 people. Benjamin Franklin owned enslaved people for much of his life, though he later became an abolitionist. A significant portion of the men who signed the Declaration were slaveholders. The hypocrisy is real. It's not a minor footnote. But here's the thing, and this is important. Pointing out the hypocrisy doesn't require us to discard the ideals. It requires us to understand the ideals as a promise that the founders themselves failed to keep, and that subsequent generations had to fight to make real. The Declaration wasn't great because it described the America that existed in 1776. It was great, and remains important, because of what it committed the country to aspire to. It set a standard that, over time, became a weapon that could be used against the very power structures its authors were embedded in. That's messy and complicated and a little uncomfortable. But it's true. Dismissing the Declaration because of the founders' hypocrisy, or pretending the hypocrisy didn't exist, both of those are ways of avoiding the complexity. The more honest approach is to hold both things at once. These were real human beings with real failings who nonetheless produced something that transcended their own limitations. It's not that unusual, actually. Most great human achievements are made by imperfect people. The question is whether the idea is bigger than the person who articulated it. In this case, it was. One last thing worth thinking about. The way we remember the Declaration has changed over time, and those changes tell us something important about where we are. In the early Republic, the Declaration was a fairly controversial political document. Different factions used it differently. Some emphasized the list of grievances against Britain. Some emphasized the philosophy. Some played it down entirely in favor of the Constitution. It wasn't until around the 1820s and 1830s, as the founding generation was dying off, as people started looking back on the Revolution with more nostalgia, that the Declaration started acquiring its sacred status in American culture. Lincoln, as we discussed, gave it a central place in his understanding of American identity. His reading that the Declaration's Equality Clause was the heart of the American promise became the dominant interpretation for much of the 20th century. The civil rights movement deepened that interpretation. The Declaration became, in many people's minds, not just a historical document, but an ongoing commitment, something that hadn't been fully realized and needed to be worked toward. More recently, debates about the founding have intensified. The 1619 Project, published by the New York Times in 2019, argued that slavery, and the racial hierarchy it created should be understood as foundational to American society and history, as central as the Declaration's ideals, if not more so. It was controversial and sparked enormous debate. The debate itself is revealing. We're still arguing about what the founding means. We're still arguing about which version of America, the idealistic Declaration version or the slaveholder Constitution version, is the real one. Maybe the answer is that both are real. Maybe America has always been a contest between those two versions of itself. Maybe the Declaration is important precisely because it gave the better version something to hold on to. A standard, a commitment, a promise that could be cited and demanded and fought for. That contest hasn't ended. It probably never fully will. Let's come back, at the end, to that room in Philadelphia. August 2nd, 1776. Most of the delegates are gathered to formally sign the engrossed copy, the official, clean version, of the Declaration. The room is warm. Outside, the war is going badly in some respects. British forces are massing in New York for what will be a punishing assault. The outcome of everything is deeply uncertain. One by one they come forward. Some reportedly made brief remarks. Benjamin Harrison of Virginia, a large man, supposedly joked to the thin Elbridge Gerry, "With me it will all be over in a minute, but you will be dancing on air an hour after I'm gone." Gallows humor, literally. John Hancock, as President of Congress, signed first, famously large. Whether he really said he signed big so King George could read it without his spectacles, that's probably apocryphal. But it makes a good story. Each man came forward and signed. What were they thinking? We can only guess. Some were probably frightened. Some were probably exhilarated. Some were probably both. Some were probably thinking about practical things. The war, the supply problems, the political disputes back home. They were human beings. Not icons, not myths. Just people doing something they believed in, or something they felt they had no choice but to do, or some mix of the two. And in doing it, they created something that outlasted all of them. Something that has been quoted and debated and fought over and invoked for nearly 250 years. Something that still matters. Maybe not in the simple, uncomplicated way we sometimes imagine, but in a real and ongoing way. The words they signed onto that day are still doing work in the world. People are still using them, still demanding that their promise be kept. That's a remarkable thing for a piece of parchment to accomplish. So, why did the signing of the Declaration of Independence change everything? Not because it instantly created a perfect democracy. It didn't. Not because the men who signed it were perfect. They weren't. It changed everything because it put ideas into the world in a form that couldn't be taken back. It said, here is what governments are for. Here is where their power comes from. Here is what happens when they fail. And here is what every human being, not just the wealthy, not just the powerful, not just the well-born, is entitled to by virtue of being human. Those ideas had existed before 1776. Smart people had been writing about them in books for decades, but the Declaration made them real in a different way. It attached them to a country, to a struggle, to a moment. It turned political philosophy into political action. And then, this is the key part, those ideas kept doing things. They kept being picked up by new people in new circumstances. They kept being used to challenge injustice, to demand inclusion, to hold power accountable. The Declaration didn't describe a finished country. It described an aspiration. And aspirations, if they're powerful enough, have a way of pulling the world in their direction. That's what Jefferson understood when he said he was trying to articulate the common sense of the subject. He was trying to write something so clear, so plainly true that once it was said, it couldn't be unsaid. He succeeded. More than he probably imagined, and we're still living in the world that document helped make. If you found this interesting, give it a like and subscribe. It really does help the channel grow. Drop a comment below telling me what aspect of the founding era you'd like to dig into next. The Constitutional Convention, the Federalist Papers, the figures who've been left out of the standard story. There's so much history here, and so much of it is genuinely fascinating once you get past the mythology and into the real human story underneath it. Thanks for watching. See you next time.